Hi, this is Randy Kirk, and I am absolutely thrilled today to be able to bring you an author whose book I read, enjoyed thoroughly, and who will give us a different take, I think, on Elon Musk and some of his buds in the early days, the PayPal mafia. So I have Jimmy Soni, who wrote a book called The Founders, and we are going to take a deep dive into a book that is really thick book. There's a lot of content there, and that really develops stories about many of these individuals who were part of the PayPal mafia. So, Jimmy, my first question for you today is: what other kinds of books? What do you do? How do you describe yourself?
That's a great question. This is like therapy, Randy. This is like I should be paying you by the hour for this. But no, just all jokes aside, I kind of have these two lives. I'm an author, and then I do ghostwriting and speech writing. And so sort of the first hours of my day when I'm in a book are spent doing books. And then the rest of the day is kind of spent helping clients express themselves, whether that's sort of CEOs, politicians, et cetera, et cetera. And, I'm really fortunate. Like my side hustle is the main hustle, and the main hustle is the side hustle in some ways. It's all writing, right? And so I've been really lucky to get to do several book projects. And as you said, the latest one was this book about the creation of PayPal. So exploring this period of internet history that it can really seem like ancient history. It's, 1998 to 2002. And that's the latest project. But I would say I'm an author and a speechwriter.
And some of the other, I have so many questions now just from that first question. So I do find I like ghostwriting. That's like done money. You don't have to, you're not taking the risk.
Right. That's actually, it's funny you say that, because I always say it's so much easier to put words in other people's mouths than to do it under my own name, because there is no risk. This is like there's no risk because you're not the one that has to bear the consequences, right? You just have to find, but it's all, there's also I think that at its best, what you're trying to do, almost everybody knows to some degree what they want to say, but what happened is they got sort of bludgeoned over the head by a bad English teacher somewhere along the way, right? And they feel like they have to sound fancier than they need to be. So a lot of times what you're there to do, I'm not sure what your experience has been, is just to clear some of the underbrush away, or to kind of clear the cruft and nonsense away, and to just get the message as simply and clearly as it can be stated, because it's not, nobody's looking for you for 7 years ago. That's rarely that what they're looking for. Generally, it's that they have a message, but they feel like there's some block, some reason they can't get to the end of it.
Well, one of the biggest blocks, of course, is how do you write a book, Randy? It's like I can't even wrap my head around the idea of writing an entire book. I think that's always the biggest block, and quite frankly, when I'm about 50% of the way through a book, I usually have this oh my gosh, I'm only half done. The rest of the time I'm good, but there's something about that 50% of the way through. Other books. What are some of the other books you've written because it was your own message?
Yeah. My first book was a book called Rome's Last Citizen, which was about an ancient Roman senator named Cato. Cato, your listeners and others will probably know the name Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar's arch nemesis was Cato the Younger. And he basically, the most important modern contribution you could say is that he mainstreamed Stoicism. But he was also this figure who has become associated with the ideals of liberty, and he was a huge inspiration to the founding fathers of the United States. And so I just honestly didn't find a good biography of him, and he was a consequential figure. And I just went ahead and said, well, why not write a proposal and see if somebody's interested? And sort of fast forward from there, I did a book about Claude Shannon, who was a 20th century mathematician and electrical engineer who worked at Bell Labs. Claude Shannon helped to create information theory, sort of the reason that information, or the kind of thinking behind information compression. So the idea that you and I can have this chat over Zoom without it taking, 2 months, without the video taking a decade to transmit. Yes. And there's a technological piece of that, which is obviously kind of the infrastructure, but there's also a part of it that is actually about the theoretical work that goes into compressing information and reproducing it with fidelity. So Shannon does that. He's also sort of a Feynman figure. He's a juggler. He's a gambler. He plays the stock market. He's got all kinds, and he is one of the 20th century's sort of great forgotten geniuses. That was another project. I did a book in between that and the founders. There was actually this really, I've never done a coffee table book before, but I connected with the late Jane Molentis, who was the kind of brains and inspiration and really the hustle that it took to restore Jane's Carousel, which is this beautiful carousel that's along the Brooklyn waterfront. And I mean, it gets millions of visitors every year. And it's kind of this thing that, like, I had a kid. So my daughter, I took her there. I mean, really dozens. Probably, I think I counted, it was like over 200 times we'd been to that carousel. Because kids don't get bored of that sort of stuff. Like, it's like, of course not. And so I just developed a friendship with her because if you go to it today and you were to visit all of the other New York carousels, you would see that its quality is a cut above. That actually, like, it just in the degree of it, like the quality of the restoration, the building that it's in, just the whole look and feel. And it turned out to have this incredible story. I mean, this carousel is a century old. It had survived a fire, survived a couple World War II, Vietnam. I mean, it was really an amazing achievement. She helped to bring it back to life and placed it, at this sort of beautiful waterfront area in Dumbo. It's a little neighborhood in Brooklyn. And so we did this incredible, it was sort of a big look at what it took to restore the thing, what it took to get it placed where it was, why it matters. So that was that. And then my latest project, obviously the founders, which was about Elon and Peter Thiel and this group of people, several hundred people who came together to create the company PayPal.
Yeah. So in the Carousel tabletop thing, did you get to interview Stephen King? Because anything about a carousel, right? You'd have King.
I did not get to interview Stephen King, but maybe I should go back and do like an update and talk to him about it. But no, it was actually, it was a fun project because it was, this is what I'll say about it is that if you walk around like any town, right, whatever town you're in, something in that town. I mean, not all town, but something in your town was made hundreds of years ago, and someone has probably put in a fair amount of time, attention, care, money, energy to keep it restored. And it's often not the government that does that. It's often private individuals that do it. And when someone does that, and they do it the way Jane did with this carousel, where the carousel was basically almost burnt to a crisp, and she sort of brought it back to life, revived it, used all the original methods that were used in the early 1900s to restore the paints, everything. I mean, this was like a truly obsessive person. Mm-hmm. It was one of those projects that you think to yourself, she would hand scrape this carousel for hours at a time. And the reason she did that with X-Acto knives, and the reason she did it herself, instead of sending it into like a big vat of chemicals, is because if you send it into a big vat of chemicals, you destroy all the original paints. And what she wanted to know was like, what did the original creators of this thing intend for it, right? And so if you take a step back and you think, wow, someone has to actually do that work, right? And what does that work entail? It's a pretty cool story. It's a story about someone being obsessed with the origins of something, about wanting to restore it to its glory. I think that stuff is really cool. And then you can find these things, they sort of dot the landscape of wherever we live. You walk around and there's a building there that's been there for 150 years. It pays to just do a quick Google search and find the history and try to understand it. That's where that project came about, I could tell that it was the quality of it was a cut above. And I just sent her a thank you note, mostly just out of sort of a, hey, my daughter loves this thing. Like, thanks. This is pretty amazing. And then we just struck up a friendship. And then I suggested to her at one point, I said, my sense is the story here is pretty cool. Like, you ought to document this because someone 100 years from now is going to care if this thing is still around. What was the origin of this? And she said, I've been keeping all these things sort of in the attic and I really ought to. And we just put our shoulders into it and a book was born.
Interesting. So interesting. So what about the founders? What was the motivation? What was the, what happened that caused you to go, oh my gosh, nobody's written a book about these founders and this would be important?
It was actually the the story begins with the book about the mathematician Claude Shannon and the place he worked, Bell Labs. So you're familiar with this, I'm sure, but for listeners who aren't, Bell Labs in the 20th century, they invent everything. It's like not much of an exaggeration to say that. It's like the transistor, touchstone dialing, cellular networks, satellite technology, 7 Nobel Prizes. On and on. And that's just like scratching the surface, right? And you have all of these people. It wasn't one person who did that. There's not one clearly identifiable figure. It's actually this group of people at these campuses in the West Village and in New Jersey during a pressure cooker of a time, including World War II, who have a federally guaranteed monopoly, but they also have just a ton of ingenuity in the room. And so they develop all these amazing technologies. And where my mind went was just, that's really interesting. What other clusters, what other groups are like that, right? Because it's the reason I think people look at like the Chicago Bulls from the 1990s. I'm a Chicagoan early on, so this is like I'm partial to this. But if you think about it, it's not that they won one championship; it's that they won 6, and Michael Jordan set basically every record you could set, right? And so it was a dynasty. And what's interesting about the PayPal Mafia is they are sort of technology's dynasty. They didn't just do PayPal; they did SpaceX, Tesla, Palantir, YouTube, Yelp, LinkedIn, Founders Fund. They've invested in every startup of consequence for 20 plus years. So it wasn't just that they were lucky one time, right? And this was a fluke. It was actually that my thesis was basically, look, you have all these people in one place at one time. You're all in your 20s. None of you really have money. How was it that you were able to do this again and again and again over the course of a lifetime? And my basic thesis was something at PayPal. There was something in the water at PayPal that taught a kind of like a cast of mind. It taught people how to do this thing called technology entrepreneurship, right? There's no guidebook. But there's no guidebook, but there was a moment in time when all of these people got their crash course in how to do this. And what I was flummoxed by, and I'm sure you can appreciate this, is one of those people was named Elon Musk. And I would have just thought that given that this was a consequential moment in his life and that he is a co-founder of this company, that someone somewhere would have said, well, maybe we should ask him about that. But nobody had. The same was true of Peter Thiel. The same was true of Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn, on and on. Every time I would sort of kick the tires on the idea, it just became clear that there was like a hole in the history that because they had because they had achieved so much later, it just became less interesting to people to look at this moment in their lives. But my view was it's actually the most interesting moment in their lives because they can't, today it's sort of the masters of the universe. They can do whatever they'd like to do, meet with whoever they'd like to meet with. And I got the sense that at that time in their lives, everything was a lot less certain, right? There was so much it was a big open question whether success would happen. And I'm inspired by those moments in people's lives. Like it's like one thing, like once you're successful, I actually kind of think you get less interesting the more successful you get, right? Because
maybe,
but
there could be a big exception to that.
True. I would say Musk is a big exception to that. Right. So let's set him to the side, right? And actually, but I will say that we should come back to that later because I think that's a part of his character. I think it's hard to maintain the kind of intensity that someone does like him after you've had a few successes, and he's had more than a few. But I just got the sense that there was something there, that this team was composed of some people who earned a lot of press, but others who deserved a lot more press, and that it was just a rollicking good story, that there was sort of the dot-com bubble bursting was such a crucible for all of these people. And I wanted to explore it. I mean, that's the truth. The truth is I come into all these projects honestly wanting to sort of scratch my own itch, which is something happened between 1998 and 2002 that brought all of these people together. What was it? Who were they? And what did they learn? That was kind of what drove me to the project.
Well, there's a good thing right there. That was a great segue. What is the main thing you learned?
I mean, there's a book's worth of full main things.
Start at the top.
Yeah, I would say I'll start at the top. Here's one. If I had to pick a main thing, I would say that the biggest thing that I took away from the process of doing the PayPal book is, I would say it's sort of the level of honesty required to do a startup like PayPal and to make it successful. And here's what I mean by that, to get sort of specific. There is a rigor about the conversations and discussions that happened like within this group of people within that company that I think is hard to achieve, but was central to their success. So what I sort of mean by that is, I interviewed all these people who worked there who would say things like, when I went into like company meetings, I was always a little nervous. Like I had to be on my A game because I knew that the people in the room, they weren't going to coddle me. They weren't going to say that my answer was good unless it was. There was an expectation within the company that if you were very junior, it didn't matter if you called somebody out who was very senior. And there was a kind of flatness to the hierarchy. And I actually had a few people say to me, they patted you on the back if you burned somebody who was higher up and you were right and they were wrong, And not that it, by the way, not that it always was a harmonious place to work, but that actually there's a kind of candor about colleagueship that is very important. And it's very hard to do right because it means not taking criticism personally. And it's, again, very hard to do right. But that's part of what I think made the company successful. And I would say if I was thinking about it, like how that operates at the life of like an individual, the question I ask myself more after doing the PayPal book is, do I have people in my life who are calling me out when I'm wrong? I know that they want what's best for me, so they're not just being mean, but do I have enough people who are challenging my assumptions, pushing my thinking? Because that is one of the things this group did very, very well, was pushing each other's thinking. I had somebody comment to me, this is not in the book, but the point of talking to you is I can share stuff that's not in the book. Somebody said to me, the funny thing about PayPal is we had people at every role who were basically the best person you would want in that role. And they stood up for what they believed in, and they sort of had great evidence. They would marshal great arguments. And I think that's a key constituent component of the company's success. It's not everything, right? It's not the whole thing. But I think if you said, look, what's the main thing? I would say the level of rigorous honesty within this team, I just was really impressed by it throughout.
So it's interesting because Elon, maybe also will end up being the most quotable person in history. Already the list of quote books that are out there and the list of quotes that are meaningful is so long. But he commonly has said to the effect, I'm not going to quote it exactly, but I need people around me who are going to give me the honest rebuke. I need that feedback. He refers to it as a feedback loop, negative feedback loop. I need that from the public. He obviously does it through Twitter. He can take on the full heat of his public, of the consumers, which as a guy who's been an entrepreneur my whole life, how much would I have loved to have been able, even today, I still sell stuff on Amazon and books. How much do we both need that review, even the negative review, that tells us what we're doing wrong and how we can change it, how we can challenge and go forward. So he's been saying that. So I wonder if that was a feeling he had before the PayPal, whether it's something he brought as a part of the zeitgeist of PayPal, or whether he learned it at PayPal.
It's a good question, and I'm not. What I would say is that in general, let me answer it a couple different ways. In general, I think one of the things that I learned about Silicon Valley and startups in general is that speed is one of the only weapons they have, right? Because if you're taking on entrenched incumbents, like one of the only luxuries you have is that you can move faster than them, work harder, log more hours, try new things. And so in that environment, it does not pay to lie to yourself or to have the company lie to itself about success and failure, right? And so if something isn't working, you actually do want people around who are able to sort of say, look, this isn't working and we don't have time or money to burn because we are not an entrenched incumbent. We don't have a balance sheet that is billions of dollars strong where we could survive a down year or a down couple of years and then make it back later, right? It's actually, by the way, this is to contrast PayPal with Bell Labs. Bell Labs had a federally guaranteed monopoly on the phone system, right? There was this great line that we found in the book where it was like an interview with the Bell Labs top gun, or like an exec. And he said, we often encourage our researchers to think in 10 and 20 year increments because Bell will be around in 10 and 20 year increments, right? PayPal didn't have that luxury. PayPal had to survive, and they had venture capital funding and a good amount of it, but not an endless amount of it. At one point, the company has only 5 to 6 months of runway left. And when you stare down the barrel of that, it forces you to just be honest about what the company's potential is, what you can do. And again, I'm not suggesting that this is some big playbook. I think this emerges somewhat organically within Silicon Valley. And it's a credit to the place that it can do this, because it's not easy to do this. It often requires, as in the story of PayPal, discarding something you've worked on for months, maybe even years, because it's not working anymore, right? And so that, I think, is a part of the place. Now, I would say for Elon Musk specifically, the thing that I learned about him is he has described it in his contemporary commentary, he's described it as maniacal urgency. But when I was researching the PayPal story, without using that phrase, I sort of saw it in the recollections of his colleagues, junior and senior, who would speak about the degree to which he believed things needed to move super quickly, that they needed to move and change the company very fast if needed, right? And I think that is who he is. I think it's also the case where you sort of have a perfect matchup of person and place. Who he is fits very well with what Silicon Valley is, right? Yes. And there's people, I think, who, like, if he were, let's take him out of Silicon Valley and make him a tenured faculty member at a university, I think he would suffer mightily because that is not a place that is suited to this kind of plowing under, right? And so you have a perfect meeting of person and place, and I would say sort of also his own interests and passions. But I think that's the biggest thing, is that it's not that he brought this energy to this team. It's actually that Silicon Valley by design is like this, that it is a place that needs to move very quickly because you're just dealing with no funding and fighting entrenched incumbents. And so, but then you also have a person in him where he has like sort of outsized energy, kind of a desire to push the limit, a desire to buck convention. And I, you know, that's sort of my broad thought is it's not one person, it's the place, but it's also a specific kind of person in that place.
Yeah. Okay. So now you keep on raising more issues than I can possibly. We're going to be on this call for 7 hours. Okay. So you talk a lot about the transition from the dot-com bust in 2000 to this PayPal group that was one of the few groups that actually was able to kind of overcome all the negatives associated with the dot-com bust. And then you've just made the point that Silicon Valley mentality is that you don't have enough money and that you're going to get, you'll be out of business if you don't hustle and rapidly iterate and fail forward, as Elon, again, some of his famous quotes. But in fact, wasn't the part of the dot-com bust was the fact that they were being given millions and millions of dollars for companies that had, no immediate use for it. Do you follow that? In other words, that was my thinking, is that at the end of the dot-com period, you could open any kind of thing that said .com on the end of it, and they would just throw money at you. Well, you have all that money, you don't have to work that hard.
I think it's an interesting proposition, which is like, did the exuberance in 1998, 1999 reach? We know that the exuberance reached a crescendo in 2000 and the market slid. What is interesting to me about the sort of thesis is, a lot of the companies that went under were companies that went public and had public company investors. They had venture capitalists early in their life cycle, but they kind of had people who maybe weren't as familiar with the kind of like potential within technology, right? And so you have to question whether the smart money or the dumb money was at the table, right? That's a real question, and I'm not entirely sure I have like a crystal clear answer, but I do think that, for example, there were companies without viable business models that went public, still had no viable business model, and did not, as you say, have the external pressure to sort of figure out their business model, right? What's interesting about PayPal is private during the dot-com bubble bursting. And so because venture capital funding has dried up in 2000, it's actually having to furiously raise money overseas. But because that raise is slow, from in the summer and fall of 2000, PayPal has to very quickly figure out how to fight fraud, get its business model right sized, reduce the red ink, right, and make sure that it's actually iterating its way to success as a business because it feels pressure. And I'll say the pressure is not abstract. I had employees who I interviewed who told me every day we would wake up and we would be convinced that that was the day they were going to tell us we were going out of business because we saw so many other .coms going out of business during that time. David Sachs, who was at one point the COO of PayPal, said it was like the killing fields in Silicon Valley at that time. Like you would just wake up and a new series of companies would go under, a new series of companies would go under. And these are companies that in January we're paying for Super Bowl ads. And by September and October, we're done, we're finished. And so the pressure on a private company, because they have to raise capital and they're not, is actually just as intense. And in some ways, I would say it's like more intense because you're dealing with individual investors, not a kind of stock ticker, right? That people, it can be a bit abstract even for people who are investors. So it is, but I would, the one place I would say that it's a little bit tricky is I think that the pressure within Silicon Valley is not just that you raise money and then the money starts to go down until you figure your business out. I think part of it is also when you are a startup fighting bigger entities, you have to be a little bit more like a guerrilla fighter, right? And so part of what I try to capture in the PayPal book is that, eBay has a payment solution. So just for listeners who might not be familiar, where PayPal takes off is this auction website that many of you are familiar with known as eBay. When it starts to take root at eBay, eBay doesn't quite have its payment stuff figured out yet, and PayPal manages to sort of worm its way within it.
Essentially, you have a competition.
Yes.
On eBay. eBay's pay system.
Yes.
Pay the eBay way, or you can pay the PayPal way.
And
on that platform.
That's right. And what PayPal has to do is spend basically 2.5 years fighting for its very existence and survival on eBay. And it's hilarious. It leads to a bunch of funny situations, a lot of negotiation, a ton of war metaphors, right? But if you think about it, like if you're Target and somebody else owns the cash registers at your stores and makes money every time those cash registers are used, if you're Target, you're understandably annoyed about this and you want to try to find a way to put them out of business, which is exactly what eBay did. And so PayPal's fighting for its life, not just because its balance sheet's going down, it also is being affected by eBay and these larger forces. It's also in a weird sort of relationship with Visa and MasterCard, who see it as something of they're almost like PayPal's like a scofflaw, like it's like taking advantage of Visa and MasterCard's rules and regs, right? Because it's essentially validating credit card transactions in this kind of gray netherworld of credit card payments. And so it is the case, though, that if you launch a startup, you are in some ways looking at the world and saying something is off, like something's wrong, and I'm going to fix it. And I'm going to make it right. But that immediately puts you in tension with other people who don't believe your thesis. And I think so it's not just money. It is this challenging of these bigger entities. In PayPal's case, it's eBay, right? You could say in Airbnb's case, it's hotels. In Uber's case, it's taxi commissions. In every case, you are actually up against some foe, some opposition that says, I don't think you're right, and we're going to crush you.
So another point that you made a few minutes ago, which maybe it was the second most important takeaway for you, since it came right up in your conversation, I don't know, I'm putting words in your mouth, is that they hired the very best, or partnered with, brought in. I'm a Ronald Reagan style manager. I believe you hire the best and then you turn them loose. I certainly seem to see that in your book, The Founders, is that not only did they hire the best, but then they had their own kingdoms, their own fiefdoms, and they weren't micromanaging anybody at PayPal.
Yeah, I think it depended. It's interesting. The team at PayPal is really sort of a collection of different teams, right? Because there's sort of technology, there's finance, there's business development, there's all these different sort of entities. There's product, and so you have actually this. There's a kind of healthy competition within the teams, I should say across the teams. And then, but I agree with your general thesis. There was a high premium within this company at this time for hiring very, very, very talented people. And I think, to some extent, we can sort of look back at the track records of some of the people they hired and say, well, yeah, those people are clearly talented. But it was a place where there were a lot of IQ points in the room, and the interview process was not easy. And where, to be honest, working there wasn't easy. Like this,
The interview process was difficult because of Peter Thiel, though, right?
No, I think no, it was difficult because they would, at the early stages, they subjected everybody they interviewed to a kind of round robin where you'd have to talk to everybody, right? You'd have to sort of, because they wanted to make sure that the people they were hiring were kind of people they wanted to have in the room all the time, because at a startup, they're working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. That was that, but it was also difficult because you were dealing with people who just, it's sort of self-evident. They're people of high intellect, and they will ask you challenging questions. They, Shrinking Violets didn't sort of do super well at the company. It didn't mean you have to be a screamer, but you had to be able to hold your own against some pretty intimidating colleagues. I mean, you're in a room with Elon Musk, and he's going to, even in his interviews, there was actually this great interview that he did with this one gentleman Sandeep Lal, who he asked Sandeep to explain something, and Sandeep did the quick version of the answer, and I won't use the French, but Musk looked at him and said, "Stop using BS words," and he said, "No, really explain it to me." And so they get up on a whiteboard, and he starts sort of drawing out a problem for him and sort of explaining it was international funds transfer problem, and so it was the case that even in your interview you were somewhat on. You were on guard. You sort of put on notice that we were going to require you to be honest here, to be forceful. And that's not the easiest interview to get through. I mean, it wasn't sort of tea time, it wasn't like cakes and tea and delicious cookies. It was somebody saying, "Don't use BS words. Explain this to me for real." And so I think that's part of it. But there is also this quality of if the people who founded the company are people of high IQ who work incredibly hard, they also want other people who have high IQs who work incredibly hard, certainly in the early days of the company. And it's sort of no accident that all of these intelligent people ended up there. At the same time, part of what happens is it becomes self-fulfilling. Those people only want to hire the best. And so there's this line in the book that Max Levchin had said, he said, A's hire A's, B's hire C's. So the first B you hire takes the whole company down. Now, I think he's exaggerating for intended effect, but I think that was definitely an article of faith there, which was, we have to be very careful that the people we bring in, one person put it to me this way. They said, we always made sure that the people we brought in bled PayPal blue. Do we think this person will bleed PayPal blue? And it was a little bit of a shorthand for, are they going to work hard? Do they care so much about this company that they're willing to really sweat for it? And are they very, very smart and sort of could fit in here, right? And there's no rubric. There was no sort of management template. In fact, if anything, it was sort of the opposite. And they obviously made some right calls and some wrong calls, but it's astonishing the degree to which they're able to warehouse talent, this company.
So speaking of talent, boy, you keep doing this for me. Speaking of talent, putting Elon Musk aside for a minute, because I think I want to do a deep dive on your thinking about Elon Musk later. Outside of Elon Musk, who was the most interesting or most impressive or most the character that you fell in love with the most? I don't know, something like that.
You're sort of asking me to pick like a favorite kid. It's like that's really tough because there's a bunch of them. I mean, the thing about the book is that I didn't just have the chance to interview Elon and others who were the bold-faced names. I had the chance to interview a lot of people who worked at the company, many of whom had never spoken about their PayPal experience before. If you're sort of saying pick one, I would say the person I opened the book with is an engineer and Silicon Valley executive named Max Levchin. And Max Levchin is an immigrant from Ukraine. He comes to the United States when he's in high school, and he has a very classic entrepreneurial journey in the United States. He's built multiple public companies. He has served on the board of Yahoo. He has obviously done very well for himself financially, but more than that, he's had the chance to really sort of dive into different technologies. He has his hand in a lot of different things. Today, the company he runs is a technology company called Affirm. And my sense of his story was that it was so unlikely, right? That this person would have had this. I mean, he grows up in the shadow of Chernobyl, manages to find his way to the United States, manages to find his way to the West Coast. And he is, by his colleagues, not this is my assessment, by his colleagues' assessment, he is brilliant and also uncommonly obsessive and great at technology. And so I really kind of glom to his story because it is actually the kind of quintessential Silicon Valley success story. And he is not somebody who is looking to you could say he's not looking for anything other than the chance to solve big problems and build big businesses around those problems, right? So whereas there may be some designs on politics for some of the people in this story, or designs on cultural influence, Max Levchin, I think, is at his happiest when he is solving problems and building businesses around those problems. And I found that very endearing. That is Silicon Valley at its best, is that. And I kind of lead the book and to some degree conclude the book with his thinking.
Interesting. So, okay, the other big name that came out, the one that everybody that's watching will know, was Peter Thiel. How did you end up thinking about Peter Thiel? Speaking of somebody who was interested in politics.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting because I spent a fair amount of time with him, interviewing him for this project. And I would say that the thing that stood out, and the thing that he very rarely gets credit for, is Peter is an almost unbelievable talent identifier and magnet. And I think it's like, I'm not even going to do a great job of describing it. There's a great book by Tyler Cowen, The Economist, called Talent, where he actually goes into Peter's kind of work and thinking on this a little bit. But Peter has an almost it's like fair to describe it as like a sixth sense, or like a supernatural ability to find talented people and then put them in positions where they can excel. And it is not just engineers, by the way, for those who might say, well, of course, he found Mark Zuckerberg. But there's a whole bunch of Mark Zuckerbergs within Peter's kind of roster of people that he has found and invested in. And one of the people in this story that he finds and invests in is Max Levchin. And he and Max become a kind of team building this company in its early days. And I would say that the curious, or kind of the thing that stood out to me when I would interview people who had been hired by Peter, almost to a person, they would say something like, he hired me for a job that I was manifestly not ready for. But he said, sort of in the Ronald Reagan motif, like he said, he basically just gave me a lot of rope and I had to make it work because I had all this responsibility. Now I got to make it real. And so there's a part of that is about identifying talent and then empowering talent to do this sort of work. And I think it's one of these things, like, it's gotten totally written out of the public profile on him. But there was someone who said to me, they said, there is no, like, actually Tyler Cowen said, he said, I'm in the business of talent identification, and I'm not even as good as Peter is at talent identification. And he's like, I wrote the book about it, and I still look to Peter as a model.
So I make a claim. One of my little theories in life is that that as much as many people aspire to live in the $10 million mansion and drive the big cars and all the rest, that there's almost no difference between us and them, other than the size of the television that we watch from 7 o'clock until 11 o'clock each night, which is probably what they're doing at the same time we are. But now you've interviewed some of these people that have mostly built up their own wealth in their lifetime. What would you say? Is there differences? Are there things that you felt in these conversations that would be different than having a conversation with a poor soul like me?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think you're more like them than you might admit, in a good way. But I would say that if your question is about sort of wealth in Silicon Valley, and other people have talked about this, but my assessment of that is that, there are places where it pays, I think, to be old money. And then there are places where it pays to be new money, or nouveau riche. And in Silicon Valley, like, there's you're only cool if you're like the latest money, like it's like your luster wears off if your IPO was 4 years ago, right? Like, what have you done for me lately, kind of thing. And but that's a joke, but the truth behind the joke is I found money within these circles to be very different than what I had expected. These are people who were frequently dressed in very casual clothing when they met me, who did not have an entourage, 25 people catering to their every need. They answered their own email in many cases. They would give me their cell phones for no apparent reason other than if I wanted to call them to ask a question, I could get to them directly without having to go through anyone. It was refreshingly simple in some ways, right? And I say that, and it can sound ludicrous, but there is actually a difference between that and many sort of, high-flying hedge fund magnates on the East Coast or something, right? And I think that part of that is that Silicon Valley is actually an engine for creating new wealth, right? It is one of the few places in economic life in the United States where you can come to the United States with nothing. You can never even having not even been born here, and in one lifetime become a billionaire, right? There's actually there's almost no places on earth where you can do that. Silicon Valley specifically is a place that just seems to do that over and over and over and over again. And so my sense is that there's not the impressive person in Silicon Valley is not the person that is building dynastic wealth. It's the person that is building a new company or a new entity, right? There's a great book, The New Thing. It was by Michael Lewis. It was about Jim Clark. And he goes into this a bit, this sort of this odd relationship between wealth and influence in Silicon Valley. What I came away with was just, particularly I would say with Musk and several others, I told my friend that I finished my interview with him, and I walked out and I was talking to a friend later that night, and I said, you know what's funny? I said, we had the conversation in this sort of vast Bel Air house that he owned at one point. And I said, but I have to tell you, if I was in a garage, the conversation would have been exactly the same. It was almost as though he did not care. Like I almost got the sense that he was like in an Airbnb, that he happened to be like, he happened into this and that it wasn't all that important to him. Right. I found that, I would say to some degree, I found it really refreshing. Like it's always, you're never going to get these things exactly right. And again, my assessments are not based on any kind of like rigorous study.
Sure.
But I never got the feeling that the wealth was the end goal, because if the wealth was the end goal, there were plenty of things that these people could be doing that had nothing to do with the work that they did every day, right? And there were sort of deeper interests and passions and pursuits, more than just sort of adding zeros to their bank accounts, right? And maybe some people will be like, well, that's naive. I actually don't think so, because if wealth were the goal, certainly Elon Musk would not have placed the bets that he did on his future companies. I mean, risking almost his entire net worth for the sake of these few firms that he has helped to create. That's hard if your goal is just to have enough money so that your great grandkids never have to work a day in their lives, right? Silicon Valley's relationship to wealth is different from other places. It is, and you're popular there if you've just made your fortune, not if you made it 20 years ago.
Yeah, I think there's a huge difference. You mentioned, somebody that's selling hedge funds on Wall Street. I think that it's not the same kind of product that you're selling. So your love or your involvement, your interest in the product is not the same. It's more about it's more about competing with the guy next to you at the next desk to be the hottest hedge fund salesman, not about how well is this hedge fund doing and what is it making for my clients. I think there's a huge difference in those kind of attitudes, and it can be a service. It doesn't have to be a product, but I think the product guys, and I happen to be one, the product guys are really, your focus is really on how can I get this product to the market, and then how can I manage it once it's on the market? How can I make sure it's selling through? How can I find new avenues to sell it in? And so how can I add products to it and around it? So you're always involved in the product. And yes, you might sometimes go, oh, if this goes well, I can retire in Hawaii. But that isn't, like you say, it isn't the end. It isn't the end.
Yeah, it's not the driving impulse. When I was doing this book, I interviewed plenty of people who had retirement money who were still in roles and responsibilities, whether at startups or at public companies, where they were working very, very, very hard. They didn't need to be working very, very, very hard, but they did. And I'm not saying that kind of life is for everyone, or that there's sort of like, I'm not judging those priorities or the other priorities. Right. I just found that it is a place that oddly, it's sort of built. It's built to sort of take amazing people and fire up their capitalist instincts, but it has a sort of allergic reaction on the other side to the money and to the capitalism, because it maintains none of the trappings of what we used to regard as wealth, right? And it doesn't mean that there's not money and houses and all those sorts of things, but the acquisition of trophies seems to be less interesting to these people than the next challenge. The title of Michael Lewis's book was The New Thing, right? Because actually his profile was of Jim Clark, and his sort of character portrait of Jim Clark is as somebody who he sort of describes at one point. He's sort of like one of these pigs who's sniffing for the new, like a truffle pig, like snuffing for like, what is the next great technology? Yeah. I got that in my meetings more than I got accounting of zeros, or sort of, it just wasn't the same. There was almost a disdain for like the day's movements in the markets, right? It was sort of far more interesting to talk about whether you thought nuclear fusion was going to be a thing, or whether you think, this technology or that technology is going to be a thing. And it is for a certain kind of person, it's a perfect place, because you can continue to maintain this kind of nerdy interest in all of these matters and you're still going to get rich. I mean, if you find the right startup and you become successful, but the riches didn't seem to be the core goal of any of the people I interviewed. Right. By the way, I might have that wrong and I may take it on the chin for it, but I did not, it was never the case that anybody said to me, oh, once I make $500 million, I'm good. That never happened. I mean, it was sort of, they were going to continue to do what they were doing.
Yeah, I cut my, earliest years of my career living in Santa Monica and Culver City. And so a lot of my friends were already millionaires. They were multimillionaires living in those places, and they hadn't stopped working. They were not, okay, I'm going to spend all my time on the golf course. They were still out there trying to make the next million, or trying to make the next product go well. So that would be my sense also, is that now that doesn't mean all of them. There's always some people that are totally, driven by the goal of some giant house on the hill. I've seen that as well, but I didn't see that nearly as often. So, all right. So now before we get to Elon, let's pick one more character. You said how to pick between them and amongst them.
Yeah.
There must be at least one more that you thought was just really, that you either spent more time in the book, or that you came away with just a sense of, that's the guy that I want to have a beer with.
Oh, I mean, there were a bunch of these kinds of individuals. And it really, I hate to say this, but it's really hard for me to pick just one. I think the other person that stood out in the book and that plays a key role in the success of PayPal is David Sachs. And the thing that I really was walked away with and wrote a lot about is his product instincts and his focus on the product at the exclusion of everything else. And this was to his great credit, because at the time he joins the company, they have built great technology, but there is no clear sense of exactly how consumers are going to use it. And David Sachs is the person that brings that discipline to bear on the company. And I will tell you that in interviewing the people who worked for him, to a person, one of the things they said is, David Sachs taught me how to do this product work well. He taught me how to focus on the end user in a rigorous way, how to use data, how to continue to refine, how to push back on engineering, how to make sure that the key things at the company that got done were important things, not for the company, but for the people using our products. Because without them, what else do we have? That is a hard role to play in a company, because it frequently puts you in conflict with your colleagues. He joked with me. He's in one of my interviews. He said, I got the reputation for being Dr. No, because I had to be the one saying no to all of these like people who had their ideas, but we really needed to stay focused on these few things. And it's a vitally important role for someone, and it's so easy to take for granted that often when you're in a company, particularly as it starts to grow, you lose sight of the end customer. You lose sight of the person using your products. And David Sachs never lost sight of the end user of PayPal's products. And that was important, because that person then can shift an entire organization into making better decisions. And I mean, frankly, like made PayPal what usable, like made it user friendly for its customers, and thus helped it to grow. And so I think that's like he's another person where I had someone say to me, I don't think we would have been successful without him, and he's a linchpin player in this story. And I spent a lot of time articulating in the book, or trying to articulate his approach to product thinking and like how he hired and all of that, because it's one of these sort of untold stories frequently around the whole PayPal narrative.
Yeah. So now would there be one of the characters who was the glue, the one who the peacemaker, the one that made things okay again after the blowups? Was there one character that was the cause of most of the blowups?
It's a rich sort of tapestry of people. Some who are diplomats, and some who are kind of change agents, let's call them. But there's a person that I interviewed who's really insanely impressive. Her name is Amy Rowe Clement. She was on the product team. She was hired directly by Elon, and she was kind of his David. Like when the companies were two separate companies. For listeners, PayPal is the merger of Elon's company and Peter Thiel and Max Levchin's company. On Elon's side, Amy joins as a pretty, she's like certainly a single-digit employee, or maybe she was employee 11 or 12, and very quickly takes on the role that David takes on, which is kind of figuring out how to make the product work, which is actually also the role of sort of you call it like a conductor of a symphony. They're making all the different pieces as work together so that the product can actually be improved upon. And she is often the one throughout the story who is kind of like, as she puts it, she said it's a mix of operator, therapist, and historian, is the way she described herself. And I think that I had multiple employees say to me, there were days I was going to quit the company until I talked to Amy. And her colleagues speak of her in reverential terms, and with good reason, because you did need somebody who could see how the different pieces of the symphony all performed, and then kind of united in shared sort of, to make beautiful music. And that was very hard for some people in the company to do, but you needed somebody who did that. So it was actually Amy Rowe Clement, who honestly is just like, I discovered in interviewing her why her colleagues spoke of her the way they did. Interesting.
And was there a disruptor? Who was the biggest?
Oh, who was it to disrupt? I mean, that's too easy, right? I mean, you're talking about a room full of them. It's everybody. It's disruptors with high IQ points, and I would say even the word disruptor. I think I would say that it's not quite right, because they're not just sort of they're not agents of chaos, right? Yeah. They're just agents of change. And so it's a little different. It's sort of disruption with a purpose. Let's call it that.
Yeah. So ultimately, and again, I want to talk about Elon kind of in your own realm. I mean, your own thinking in general about Elon, but he was in fact the one who, in the end, well, not in the end, but in his end with PayPal, created the most chaos, because he was, according to, I think, your book and other books on the subject, he had a bigger vision. He had the vision of becoming a full-on bank and offering mortgages and a stock exchange. I mean, a way to trade stock and everything else. And nobody else wanted to go that direction. And this seemed to be a schism that was impossible to bridge. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was a pretty dramatic moment in the story. So to take a step back, when Elon begins to create his half of the company that becomes PayPal, he calls it X.com, and it's meant to be the kind of world's home for all things financial. So if you have a mortgage, if you have a loan, if you have anything financial, anything that touches your life financially, he wants to live at X.com. And that's a very big vision. I mean, it's huge. At one point I was interviewing him, and he said, I just wanted to be the global financial system. It was that simple. And I'm thinking to myself, like, wow, like that's,
and you want to go to Mars, and you
right.
And change everything about energy.
Yeah. And so he has this vision for X.com. And by the way, if you peel back a layer, the logic behind that ambition makes a great deal of sense. And much of it has actually come to pass in the 20 years since. Here's what I mean. He would ask me the question, sort of do it rhetorically. He would say, like, why do you have to pay a fee for the movement of money anymore in modern society, right? And it's a completely fair question. And his point is, today, the movement of money is not physically moving dollars or gold from place to place. It's moving digits in a database. But if moving digits in a database is a basically costless thing, then why are people being charged for incoming wire fees? Right? It's a very fair critique, like 1,000% fair critique. He is asking it at a time when people are still using dial-up modems, when internet finance is in its infancy, when a lot of the things that you and I take for granted don't exist, right? But that's exactly like why he is who he is. He's asking questions about things that don't exist and arguing they should. His view was that banks were running on outdated database technology, and that if you could basically root and branch change all this stuff, you would reduce costs for customers. If I needed to send you, Randy, $5, and we all were on X.com, it shouldn't cost me anything to send you 5,000 or $5, 5,000, 50,000, 5 million. It's a costless transaction. We shouldn't be billed for that. His view is that the banks were billing people for things they shouldn't be charging them for. So if he were going to be where all the money is, as he put it in the future, as he's put it since, if you're just where all the money is, you're the global financial system. So that's the ambition. Part of that ambition is person-to-person payments, which is what PayPal becomes. When X.com launches, it has person-to-person payments as an option, but it's not the core of the business. When these two entities merge, X.com and Confinity, which has this little product called PayPal, when they merge, person-to-person payments is the thing that they are all focused on because they're trying to beat each other in a kind of race on eBay. When they merge, they're one company. There's a group of people within the company who believe that Elon's vision is too big for that moment. They're losing money to fraud. The markets are collapsing. There's a lot of pressure. And they are all saying to themselves, listen, this X.com idea might be a good thing, but it is simply more than we're biting off more than we can chew. That conflict and others come to a head in late 2000. And Elon is sort of, there's a coup. He's deposed from his position. He ends up serving as a very good board member for the remainder of his time at PayPal, but he is pushed out because that's part of the reason why he's pushed out, is the belief that the vision is too big. The second reason is that he had wanted to re-architect PayPal on a kind of Microsoft-based technology. And the engineers who designed the original PayPal had used Linux to design their technology. And even in this, I try to give everybody a fair hearing. So I sort of let him explain himself and I let the other engineers explain themselves. His view was at the time, you could pull a lot of things that Microsoft had already done and already coded, so you could move more quickly toward your end goal. And this put him into conflict with many engineers on the Confinity side. And that's another sort of reason why. And then there's a few other things that happen here and there. But the point is that in hindsight, and this is Musk saying this, he said to me, we were talking about this moment, and I had the misfortune of asking this person about the time he was fired. And he said, he's like, look, if I look back on it, it all kind of worked out. And he was like sort of jovial about it in his own way. What was more interesting is that I had an engineer who worked for him during this period write to me and say, he said, Steve Jobs made Pixar great because he was fired from Apple. And he said, Elon was able to make Tesla great and build SpaceX because he was fired from PayPal. And it's a really interesting, like if you run the counterfactual, there's a lot of truth to that. Sure. Actually, when I was interviewing him, Elon said, if I hadn't been pushed out, it's quite possible I would have just wanted to stay at PayPal and make it $1 trillion company. Those are his words. He said, I would have wanted to just stay there because I would have just wanted to win. And I think there's something about that fluke of history that ends up actually being great for everybody involved, which is he moves on to other ventures and PayPal ends up going public a couple of years later.
So have you ended up, after writing this book, continuing to follow these careers? It would seem like you almost couldn't. I mean, not.
I do, but I have a casual interest. I'm not somebody who follows every one of the little clips and things. It's funny. I feel like I had a luxurious point of view, you could call it. The luxury of my point of view was that I was going to write about something they did what felt to them 1 million years ago, 1998 to 2002. And then I could just leave. Like I didn't have to keep doing it. It's like, I don't want to write about Twitter or any, just sort of like, I want to walk away from it all. And I have that privilege. Right. But it was, so the honest answer to your question is I'm not the person who is most up to date on every little coming and going. I follow the things they do that are in the media, and I will occasionally send a note or two if I notice something that I think is interesting or something that emerged from my PayPal research that's sort of from the nostalgia bin that they might have forgotten. Right. Mostly just for humor. I just do it to be funny. And because I think sometimes people like this can appreciate looking back 20 years and seeing some old news clipping or something.
Sure.
But I have moved on because it's just not my place to, I don't do daily journalism on these companies. And so I just don't really have an in, and I don't have anything that I want to say about it that I think isn't already out there.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what about the other side of it? Did you become a fan? I'm like, I totally admit that I'm an Elon Musk fanboy, and I'm not someone who's inclined towards fandom. It's never, I think the last person I was a fan of might've been Barbara Streisand. So
that's funny.
I'm not inclined towards being a fan, but I am sold out as a fan on Elon Musk. So did you become a fan? Do you feel any fandom towards any of these folks you chronicled?
It's a good question. I think I tried very hard not to be, a sort of unfair critic and not an overboard fan, particularly during the writing of the book. Sure. You want to maintain a kind of neutrality because if you, at least for me, for the kind of book I wanted to do, if you're in the middle of it and you just are always looking for every, positive or negative angle, for me, I found that it made the writing harder. Like I couldn't get the facts down on paper. Here's what I would say.
I think what you were doing lend itself to trying to be neutral. Yes.
Yeah. What I would say though is I did walk away with an admiration for his endurance. So that I feel pretty strong on, and here's why. I have this closing riff to chapter 14, and I must have labored over this riff for a while. I mean, this is sort of the final stanzas on his role in the story. And during the course of doing all of this, when I was kind of thinking through everything that he had been through, between 1998 and 2002, he loses a child, he's pushed out of the company, he almost dies in a car accident, and he almost dies because of malaria and meningitis. And in the immediate aftermath of that, he starts to build SpaceX. I mean, literally, he purchases the URL, SpaceX.com, and registers the company. And what I thought to myself is that if I had been through any one of those things, I don't know that I would have the wherewithal to pick myself up, dust myself off, and start all over again. It feels like it would be especially, by the way, I'd say the biggest of the things I just described, losing a child. I mean, I have a kid. I don't even like to imagine it. It's so devastating to even think about that possibility. So to live through it, and then to live through all the other things, and decide that you're not going to retire. You're not just going to hang it up, but actually what you're going to go do is continue to do this thing that you feel called to do. I think whatever else people may believe about him, that is worthy of admiration, because that takes an unbelievable amount of endurance and an unbelievable amount of just resolve, commitment to because think about how easy it would have been. I mean, he was wealthy. He could have just spent his sort of days of sort of faded multimillionaire, sort of out of the limelight, gone and had houses in warm places and decided that was it. Life was great. But he didn't. And to his enormous credit, he challenges Boeing and Raytheon and all these other people who make rockets and things, right? He challenges the auto industry. And now the rest of the auto industry is having to catch up with him and Tesla. Can you imagine what it takes to go through such difficulty and then come out on the other side and say you're going to do it all over again? I mean, I can't. I'm not sure that I would have that sort of, that I would have whatever it is that takes, whatever that ingredient is. I'm not sure I have it. So I would say I haven't emerged a fan, but I admire his endurance between the years 2000 and 2003 more than I did before I began this project.
Yeah, so I don't want to in any way, get in the way of your admiration for his endurance. I do think, based on my own experience in life and the experience of other entrepreneurs that I've known, there's a certain sense of which you can't not.
Fair enough.
Yeah, people say, "Why did you write that book?" I couldn't not. It was in my head. It was like bursting to get out. Why did you start that company? Because I saw the bright shiny object and I wanted to go after it. So there is a certain, I think, personality that thinks that way. That it's just bursting to get out of you. Writers, music writers, so the songs just burst out of them. But on the other side of the coin, when you go through the trauma, and I've recently experienced my own trauma of those kind of levels, there has to be a comeback. So it is possible to actually have your life destroyed by those traumas and not be able to pull yourself back up again,
right?
Even if your inclination is to invent and create, and that's what motivates you and drives you. So you can allow it to completely, we can think of people. Hughes comes to mind right away.
Right.
Somebody who went absolutely nuts. And there's other people of that level that went nuts because of apparently trauma that was part of what was, and it can be within the business environment.
Yeah.
The trauma of the loss of the business, or a product failing, or people that leave, or, so those might be even more likely to cause the kind of trauma that would hurt a major inventor.
I think that's right. And I think you're right that there's an entrepreneurial gene or instinct that leads people to want to do it again. But I think personal difficulties at that scale, as you said, can basically unsettle your entire being, right? I mean, they can shift, and people find religion. They move to ashrams. I mean, they do all kinds of things. They become recluses. They decide that they're there's all these decisions in ways in which people who go through, and by the way, understandably, particularly with certain personal difficulties, no one would have faulted him for hanging it up, right? Or anybody really. And that's what's actually astounding about this sort of what came next, the next chapters. And I think there's something about that is worth studying, particularly, I would say, for younger entrepreneurs, maybe who are in the aftermath of difficulty or failure, where, that his ability to do it again is actually the thing to understand, not the success, but the precursor to the success.
Yeah. When were you interviewing Elon Musk?
These are the years sort of 2019 to 2022. Were kind of the correspondences and interviews during that period. And so it was pre the acquisition of Twitter, but it was post some difficulties at SpaceX and Tesla. And it ended up, working out well, but it was not an easy time by any stretch. And I think, again, that's just you look at the things he's built, and the thing I think about always now is the years 1998 to 2002.
Yeah. So if you saw me turning green with envy during that period, during that conversation, of course, 2019 to 2022 is when I would have loved to have had that interview.
There's still time. He's still active in the world.
I am green with envy.
There's still time.
So, all right, now let's talk about the personal side. I mean, there just isn't a lot of folks. There's lots and lots. There's, of course, hundreds and maybe thousands of folks who have been in the room with him and have gotten a chance to meet him in a certain way. You met him as an interviewer. What were some of your other takeaways? You talked about the feeling that wealth wasn't important, and that you could have been having that same conversation in a garage. What are the kinds of things did you come away? This is, I think, what my fans of this channel are most interested in. Is funny. Who is he really? And how can we use that to make decisions on our stock investment? Oh,
yeah. Well, let's be clear about. The disclaimer should be: don't listen to me anything about related to stock investments.
But as fans or investors, knowing the CEO of the company we're investing in.
Yeah.
So yes, we always say this is not investment.
Right, not investment. Well, I would say there's sort of two things, and I'm not sure they're easily missed. One is he is very clever with literary references and kind of references to things like the Bible or sort of great works within the kind of Western canon. I found him to be phenomenally well read, even outside of science and technology. And it's interesting because you don't sort of get that necessarily if you're reading the daily coverage, but it was a unique experience to see sort of some of the metaphors and analogies and things that he would use and make reference. For example, when we talked about why he didn't burn the company down after he was pushed out, he talked about King Solomon and the Bible. And so I found that was interesting to me, and it was actually amazing, like that he had as wide a range as he did culturally and historically. And obviously some of this is it becomes clear on Twitter when he'll make references to ancient Rome and ancient Greece. But it was more apparent in person because I could just see that he wasn't like furiously Googling something interesting to say and then playing it back to me. It was more just that it was in the course of explaining something to me, he would reference history in a way that suggested that he was far, far better read than people appreciate. The other thing I would say is I had the experience of asking him about a particularly difficult moment in the PayPal history, which is when he is pushed out. And when he went back and looked at that moment, what he played back to me was the things he wished he had done differently. And, there can be some agreement or disagreement about the particulars, but he had mined that moment for a lot of insight. And so I think there are all of these people who will say like, oh, he just, in Silicon Valley, you just have to move forward and never look backward. But this was so clearly somebody who had like looked back at this moment and thought about it a lot and had very concrete things that he said, I wish I'd done this. Here's what I learned from this. Here's what I did differently because of it. There was a high degree of reflective, of just reflection on the moment and then change in behavior as a result. And I was very impressed. I mean, it was hard not to be impressed because this stranger comes into your home. He's asking you about this crazy moment in your life, and he chapter and verse went through and was very honest about like, here's what I would have done differently. Here's how I would have communicated differently. I would not have left the company for my honeymoon for that period. Like I would have done this, this, and this. Should have done a better job communicating with my CTO. I mean, on and on. And so my sense is that that's not like, he wasn't putting on an act. He didn't know me, it wasn't again, like we paused the interview and then he went and prepared or like, it was just natural. He was saying, here are the things I would have done differently. Here's what I learned. And I found that very, I think that's probably relevant for the people who are listening, that this is somebody who, in the same way Silicon Valley companies learn very quickly from their mistakes, he is somebody who learns even more quickly from his mistakes and has really mined all of these moments for a lot of insight. And that's, I suppose, if you are a follower or or investor, I suppose that's encouraging. I mean, I hope it is. I'm not trying to say that it is necessarily, but I think it's probably a good thing. And maybe all company CEOs do it. But I can tell you this, there are plenty of people who would not have allowed me to ask the questions I asked about that moment. So he didn't shirk from it. We didn't stop the interview before we got there. We didn't like have a sudden phone call that came in. He went straight at it. And I have to say, I was impressed by the honesty, by the commitment to like reflecting on that moment. It's not easy. It was very hard personally at that time, but he went and had learned a great deal from it.
So did you get to the personal side at all? Was it important for you to know his personal life?
No,
in order
not really, because there was nothing about that was particularly relevant to the PayPal story. I also think that people take the personal and distort it and cheapen it and do all these other goofy things with it. And my questions to him were about finance and about payment systems and about network effects and about how do you build a company? What was it like to build this company from scratch? How did you make the decision about college and all of this other stuff? There wasn't really much there that was personal. I think the one place that's true though is mentor Peter Nicholson. We spoke about his mentor for some time, and we spoke about Greg Khoury, a friend of his who is a co-founder of Zip2, who passed away at the 51 or 52. And I asked Elon about Greg Khoury because he was a consequential person in his early life. And I just got the sense that there was sort of, that he had taught him a lot, that he had really taught him about business and they had lived together for a period while they were building Zip2. And I had seen some references to him in different places, but it was actually like one of the questions that I kicked off an interview with was to say, look, can we not talk about PayPal? I want to talk about Greg Khoury. And it helped me explain who Greg was in Elon's life and make that come to life for readers.
All right. And what were the influences? I mean, what were the takeaways from that part of the conversation about these one or both of these mentors? How I can again identify, because I had those mentors. What were the big takeaways for you?
He had a great little riff about Greg. It's in the book. He says he called him a trickster with a heart of gold. And I think, if you think about, sometimes the praise people give about others is the thing they're trying to live up to themselves, right? So if you think about that phrase, like trickster with a heart of gold, I think in some moments, it's a very fair, it might be what Elon Musk would want said about himself, right? That he has a sense of humor, but that his ambitions are about humanity, that they're about energy, that they're about exploring, the universe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know, because I don't follow much of that other stuff. But what was interesting was how he had described Greg in these terms that suggested that it was almost like an older brother type figure, right? That he really took him under his wing, that Greg was more savvy about business in general. Like Elon was a coder at that time. Remember, when he was in his early 20s, he's writing code. He's not a business titan. He's somebody who's very good with technology. He's writing code. Greg was savvier with business. And so that balance worked very well in the building of Zip2. With Dr. Nicholson, the cool thing was when I asked him about Dr. Nicholson, Elon, to kind of not cut me off, but right away he's like, man, super smart, giant brain. It was actually, he said it was so much emotion. And you could tell even in that comment, the reverence for intelligence, because Dr. Nicholson is very smart. He had a PhD from Stanford. He had been involved in Canadian politics. He had been negotiating fisheries deals for Canada. And he was a very impressive figure who is much older than Elon and comes into Elon's life when Elon is in college. And so we just talked about that. We just talked about what he learned from him, their time together. And then I actually had the chance to interview Dr. Nicholson and spent a lot of time talking to him. And so it was that part of it was interesting. But I would say that you can tell a lot about somebody by the people that they look up to. And in both of those cases, it was clear that he looked up to these people. And perhaps you could extend that. I didn't have a chance to ask him about this, but it's an easy speculation to say he respects scientific rigor and intelligence, meaning he being Elon respects scientific rigor and intelligence, and he respects a trickster with a heart of gold, right? Somebody who is trying to ultimately do the right thing.
Well, you know what? That is almost, I don't know. Do you do this on purpose? It's like you set up your own segues.
No.
And you almost set up your own exit. Your own.
That's hilarious.
How can you end an interview about Elon Musk any better than that? That's so beautiful. Well, Jimmy Soni, it has been phenomenal to spend this time with you. And I know we could go on for hours and hours, but I think we would probably start to get into the stuff that would be really interesting to you and me, but may not be interesting
right.
to the crowd, So you've done a remarkable piece of work here. Highly recommend it to my audience. If you haven't read The Founders yet, you should definitely read The Founders. It was actually the first book that I've ever listened to.
Oh, that's great.
My first audiobook. So I'm not inclined towards listening to books, but I thought, I need to be able. It's a little long, folks. it's a big book.
Readable, but long.
It's readable. Oh yeah. So you never lose the chase.
Right.
It's definitely always a page turner, but it is. But by putting it in my ear, I was able to do it while I was driving and other activities. So. Again, Jimmy Soni, glad to have you on board, and maybe we'll do it again someday if something comes up that makes sense.
Randy, I would love that. That round 2 would be great fun.
Okay, all right. Well, you know what to do. If you like the interview, say you like the interview. Leave your comments for sure on this show, because I want to hear what you thought about the interview in general, but also, did you like the format? We're trying different formats, of course, and I'd love to know whether this long form interview format was interesting for you. And then, of course, join Patreon, because we're going to be doing stuff on Patreon that'll be almost an outgrowth of what we talked about in this interview. So again, Jimmy, thank you very much for being on board. And to all of you, it's been great talking to you.
Click the link below to get your paperback, Kindle, or audiobook now.